And so okay, tonight I was going to talk about two artists who actually have a lot in common and who are always linked, which is Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt. But there's a lot of misapprehension. For instance, Mary Cassatt was never a student of Degas. They actually were considered each other equals. But they have quite a few things in common. One of them is they're both haute bourgeoisie. I mean, they both come from very wealthy, very well-placed families. They have connections to high society. Degas in Paris, Mary Cassatt in the United States. Also, they're both American. Degas is only half American, but his mother, interestingly enough, was Creole from New Orleans. And I should open up I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's all right. Let's give you an image to look at while I'm blathering here. Okay. There, and I'm calling. If I was going to give this talk a title, I'd call it "The American Connection," because it was actually this American connection, which is of course strongest in the case of Mary Cassatt, actually saved the Impressionist movement at a certain point, which I did not know this before I did preparations for this talk. But Degas himself is born, as you can see, 1834. So he's around the same age as Manet. The family fortune was in cotton in the South. His father was a banker. Degas began painting at art training at 11. He was totally obsessed with the subject. His mother died at 13. And at that point, he was surrounded by his father and his uncles who didn't support the idea of him becoming a painter, as it's the usual story. And in fact, he went to law school his father insisted he go to law school in 1853. He lasted 2 years and then just dropped out. And 1855, while hanging out, I believe at the Louvre, he meets Ingres, who was, and this is also something he has in common with Cassatt. Both of them were great admirers of Ingres. And Ingres said to him, "Draw lines, young man, and still more lines from both life and memory, and you will become a good artist," which he for his whole life, he did actually look at art from the point of view of the linear design. So he stayed true to that. So apart from having a family in America, his family also had connections in Italy. So after he's admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts in around 1855, a little later, he travels to Italy, to Naples. Now, Naples in those days was a flourishing and very wealthy city. It was quite different than it is today. And he stayed with his relatives, the Bellelli family. And he painted this picture of them. Quite a large painting that he would later show in Paris, and he'd receive a lot of, at the Salon, he received a lot of praise for it. It shows that at this point, he's still very much in the classical painting mold.
Do you know how big this was at all?
I don't know the exact size. I could look
Yeah,
it
just
up.
the detail on the back, like the antiques on the fireplace.
Yeah,
It's so tiny. It's like really detailed. Like, I
he
wonder how.
does immense amount of detail even in small things on
Yeah,
occasion. Yeah.
like
Um,
the white aprons, like super detailed, like the wrinkles and stuff.
so
Yeah.
while he's in Italy, he also travels, of course, to Rome and Florence and Venice. He copies Michelangelo, Titian, Raphael. And usually what he copied were actually a section of a painting that had a portrait of someone in it. Didn't copy the whole painting. But he came back enamored of classical art. And this is the Spartan, young Spartans exercising together. If you remember, if you know anything about Spartan society, it was a totally militaristic society where both where the women were separate but equal within the culture. Um, it's an interesting painting. You can already see elements of his later work in it, I think. He's still continuing at this point to do classically derived paintings. This is unfinished, but it's Alexander taming Bucephalus, who the horse that will become his famous horse. Like many of Degas' paintings, he spent a long time finishing them, and a lot of them are unfinished. Okay, while he was copying Velázquez at the in the Louvre, he ran into, well, I think probably no, he was painting next to Manet, and they started talking. They were both copying Velázquez, and Manet, in the conversation, suggested to him that it might make sense to paint the modern world instead of his imaginings of the ancient world. And this is Degas' first painting where he takes on the modern world. And it also, riders and horses will become a constant theme in his work as he looks at the modern world and decides what he's going to paint. Being also of the upper class, it's jockeys and dancers and performers are his primary subjects for the rest of his life. And this was also one of his first essays into that whole culture. Now, so I mentioned Manet, and this is a painting that yeah, I know, it looks a little odd, doesn't it? While they were close, Degas painted this picture of Manet with his wife at the piano. If you remember, Manet's wife had originally been his piano teacher. So he gave it to Manet, and then he visits him a while later, and he discovers that the right-hand side of the painting is missing. Someone has torn it off. And Manet gives no explanation for this. And Degas, as any artist would be, is kind of upset and says, I want my painting back. And he took it back with the intention of repainting Manet's wife, but he never did. It was found in his studio after his death. But it raises a number of questions. The deepest question it raises, of course, is not about Renoir, but about Manet. How could this have happened? Why would he have done this? Because presumably he did it, unless his wife did it. But Degas had a stormy relationship with everyone. He was an extremely difficult person. But he goes back to his dancers and well, he starts taking on this as a primary subject, and this is one of his earliest attempts at it, and it's already very mature, you can see. though at this point it's still, the style is still fairly classical. The use of the color is quite restrained, and the painting is largely finished. He now takes an extended stay. Whoops, sorry. Before I say that, this is a painting, a very actually wonderful painting of his father, listening to Lorenzo Pagans playing a guitar. And it was around this time, shortly after this, he went to New Orleans and spent a year, more than a year, with his brother. And this is known as the Cotton Office, which was very well received in New Orleans. It made him somewhat of a name in America, and was also very, very well received in France. But in terms of his character, he's in the South. His family has a major business there in the cotton industry. He has to have been very aware of, and this is, he has to have been very aware of the conditions in the South at that point. But there's no indication of people of color in this. Well, maybe this gentleman here, actually. But it's relevant to who he is, because he had some very deep racial and prejudices against women too. Okay, he's now really taking on the the subject of the ballet, and it's actually around this time that his father dies, and he learns that his brother has assumed huge debts in the New World. So he sells off the family home and the entire family art collection to erase his brother's debts, but then he's without almost any money. So he now has to support himself from his paintings. This is an interesting one. It's unfinished, but it shows him looking at contemporary life with more attention. By the way, neither he nor Cassatt actually painted on scene from life. These are all studio paintings, or they're based on sketches done on site, and sometimes on photographs. This is an unfinished painting of absinthe drinkers. And it gives you an idea of how he starts a painting. It's very interesting that way. So around, shortly after this, by the way, around this time, he joins the Impressionists in their exhibitions. He never considered himself an Impressionist, but he took a very active role in organizing the exhibitions, but he was always arguing with the Impressionists. In fact, he made fun of people who painted outside. He at one point said the government should appoint gendarmes to police these ragamuffin artists who work outside, and maybe give them a taste of buckshot every so often. This is the way he talked. But he takes a major role in organizing these exhibitions, because of course his survival as an artist is dependent now on selling work. But he's also paying much more attention to the world around him. And in this painting, you can see he's taken on artificial lighting in a very interesting way, which prefigures what Toulouse-Lautrec will do with this subject. Toulouse-Lautrec, by the way, was an immense admirer of Degas. The other thing that's going on is he, like all the Impressionists, is fascinated both by photography and also by Japanese art. And he's interested in new forms of composition. So in 1877, he visits Mary Cassatt in her studio. He'd been aware of her for a while because he's in the upper levels of society, and she was selling in Paris. She'd set up a studio there, and she was selling her work. So, and he invites her to be in the next Impressionist exhibition. And they form quite a tight friendship for quite a while. They're both utterly focused on their art. Both of them never marry, and in fact, both of them are celibate almost their whole lives. Totally focused on their work. And they're both really classicists who've taken on the contemporary world and adopted Impressionist techniques. They're not really Impressionists at all, though they're lumped with them. This is a very interesting painting at the Stock Exchange, commissioned by this gentleman here, who was a wealthy stockbroker, who was Jewish. And a lot of people have looked at this painting and said it shows Degas' anti-Semitism, which wasn't that hidden in the way he's kind of exaggerated this man's profile to give it the classical Jewish profile. This was, during his life, he did quite a bit of sculpture. This is the only one he ever showed, the little ballerina. And this brings up a whole can of worms, actually. Well, first, let me quote something he said about his painting of the ballerinas. People call me the painter of dancing girls. It has never occurred to them that my chief interest in dancers lies in rendering movement and painting pretty clothes. He viewed the dancers the way many men in that time in society viewed them. They were these young girls who were apprenticing, were known as rats. And the reason was rats were known to carry syphilis. And what was going on behind the scenes in the ballet in France, the ballet in France at that point was very corrupt. They didn't have full performances. They were interludes of ballet dancers in other performances, which might have had can-can girls, clowns, and then ballet dancers. Well, where they were training, men of means could gain entrance. And in many cases, because these girls were working in the ballet to bring a little bit of extra money home, because they were, many of them, from the poorest of the poor, and there were a lot of poor in Paris in those days, their mothers would pimp them to these wealthy men who were known as the abonnés. So this is what was going on behind the scenes, and Degas was very aware of this. As far as we know, he never took advantage of these girls or any women. But he had a kind of contempt for them, which actually, at the same time that he likes the beauty of the dance and the clothing, the face of this girl, which is a little hard to see here, I really should have got another one, is he actually, they have photographs of the young woman who modeled for him, and he made her look more primitive and animalistic than she actually was. So he's a, you know, this is a very problematic artist to understand. He once said, I've locked away my heart in a little pink slipper. He was a very defensive, protective man, probably extremely sensitive inside, but on the surface, quite offensive. But capable of these really interesting paintings. So here you can see what he said about it, how he was interested in movement. Here, the animals, because he called the dancers women animals, actually. The animals are horses, and there's an incredible amount of sense of movement. I mean, it's a brilliant composition from the point of view of movement. And this, I mean, this one to me is very, really communicates the hard work that these women who are ironing are doing. And one would think that it communicates a great deal of empathy. So he's a puzzle, this artist. This has a huge influence. This image appears in variations, very different variations, but by Lautrec and later by Picasso. Here the hats take front row seat to the model, who happens to be Mary Cassatt. She modeled for him quite frequently during the early years of their friendship. And in fact, they experimented with materials together and did a lot of work together. This is almost certainly Suzanne Valadon that we talked about earlier. Lautrec had introduced her to Degas. But this is the final subject that becomes quite common in his work, the women bathing. This I know is Suzanne Valadon. Now, towards the end of his life, well, not the end of his life, around because he lives to, just a second, let me get my dates right. He lives to 1917, but around 1907, his sight really begins to deteriorate. And by 1910, he actually stops painting altogether. But at this point, his sight is deteriorating, but he's still doing some wonderful paintings and pastels. This one, I think, is a painting, but they're simpler now. And I think a little bit like Monet's later paintings, he's painting partly in the dark. His sight is bad, but he has so much experience, he can still do what are actually very radical paintings for their time. This is a pastel. He reintroduced pastel as a major medium. And Mary Cassatt took it up and also did many, many really brilliant pastels. So, of course, he had an enormous falling out with all his friends in 1894, completely avoided all his Jewish friends from that moment on, quarreled with everyone. And by the end of his life, his later years, and argues with Cassatt actually over the Dreyfus affair, ceases working around 1912 at all and wanders Paris nearly blind for the last few years of his life. This was done after he'd become blind and could not paint at all, but he could still do sculpture. And this was found, as a wax model in his studio and cast after his death, along with most of his other sculptures. Mary Cassatt. This is a self-portrait. So she's born in Pennsylvania. Her father's a stockbroker and a land speculator who once said he would rather see his daughter dead than a painter. Good father. Her family was very, very privileged, and the tour of Europe was on the, was something that all wealthy families in the United States considered obligatory. So she traveled a lot as a child, and we think that when she was 11, she would have, for the first time, seen Ingres, Delacroix, Corot, Courbet at the World Fair in Paris. In any case, very early on, she decided she wanted to be a painter, much against her father's wishes. She studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts for 4 years, 1861 to 65. And she said of it that there was no teaching and the women were not allowed to see the live models. So she walked out at a certain point, and over her father's objections, she headed for Paris in 1866, where she studied under the leading classical painter in France at the time, the one who was making a fortune off his work while the Impressionists were starving.
Anthony?
Yeah.
I just had a question about that self-portrait. How did she get that dress just blows my mind, the whiteness of the white. It's just like, is it just how it's set against that neutral background? I don't know.
Yes, it's a matter of there's several things going on. One is that it's lighter than anything else in the painting, the pure white that she's put on top. The pure white might have a tiny bit of yellow in it, actually, and it's contrasting with a slightly violet hue that's kicking it even further out and causing it to vibrate.
Okay, thank you. It's
yeah,
beautiful.
But we're going to see a lot more of that with her. Anyway, this is the kind of work that was considered appropriate and brilliant art of the time. I mean, it certainly is. You can see that Jerome was incredibly well gifted and skilled. And this is a famous painting. This is where we got the phrase "thumbs down" from, this painting. Here, the Vestal Virgins here are giving thumbs down. They're encouraging the fighter here to actually kill his victim. This is another of his paintings, a little bit easier to look at, but his work was voyeuristic, and it was like a grand spectacle. And he painted a number of slave markets of Rome, always had a very beautifully naked woman in the middle of the slave market being auctioned. So it's a voyeuristic kind of art, escapist and voyeuristic. But his technique was something that a lot of artists wanted to learn. And actually, Degas studied with him for a while too. So this was a painting that she did at the time that was very well received in Paris. And unfortunately, though, she was unable to stay there because just as she was beginning to make a name for herself in Paris, the Franco-Prussian War occurred, and she returned home to her family in Pennsylvania, and to a situation where she couldn't sell her work. Her father refused to, he allowed her to live with the family, but he would not give her the money for materials, which were quite expensive in those days. She spent 6 weeks not painting and saying she was going to give up painting in a state of, in a terrible state. Then she went to Chicago to see if she could drum up some business there, and lost a whole bunch of paintings in the Chicago fire. So you can imagine that she's really down at this point, but very, very luckily for her, the Bishop of Pittsburgh, who knew the family, commissioned her to go to Parma in Italy and copy a couple of Correggios that he wanted for his church. And he gave her traveling expenses, living expenses, as well as whatever it would cost to produce the copies. So she goes to Parma, where she's a sensation. She copies the Correggios, but she also does this painting, which is two women at Carnival. It was a tradition in those days when they had Carnival in Parma, and probably elsewhere in Italy, for the young women to throw flowers down to the men that they were interested in. And this is what she's painting here. And this painting was a sensation in Parma. And when she brought it back to France, it actually helped to make her name. She realized she could stay in France and sell work. She opened a studio, another one of that period. And then Degas invites her to show with the Impressionists. And she begins to meet the Impressionists. And remember, she can't go to the cafes. Women of substance and with some sort of reputation couldn't mix with the artists in the cafes. It was only the demi-mondaine women, the women who were considered lower class and morally suspect, who hung out with the artists in the cafes. So she would meet the artists either at their homes or at the exhibitions. But she obviously developed relationships with many of them. She became very close with Bertha Morisot, but here we see Sisley's wife. And it's a wonderfully tender portrait, I think, of Sisley's wife. So she's now working a lot with Degas. And in this painting, actually in cleaning this painting, they found different brushstrokes in this area, and they realized they were Degas brushstrokes. He'd actually modified her painting. It was originally horizontal here, and he suggested this angle to create more tension in the painting. But she would make suggestions to him too. It wasn't all a one-way thing, and he learned a lot from her. And she was able to put up with his constant criticism of women and other artists. She was tough, and she didn't care about that kind of thing. So she's taking on some of the same subjects that he was, and that also Manet was dealing with. And you can see that Degas is having somewhat of an influence on the way she paints and the colors she uses. I think this is a lovely painting. She's like Degas, she's fascinated by Japanese prints, and you can see the influence here. I think this is a lovely still life. This is a pastel, and it's something she and Degas both experimented with a lot, and she really took to a high level. She's also playing with color and reflected light in the face in a way that presages Lautrec's later paintings. So this was a painting that Degas painted of her, a portrait. And she hated it. She didn't tell him that, but she later gave it to someone to sell at an auction in the United States. And she said, don't tell them that it's me. But she did this one of herself at apparently the same time, because she's wearing exactly the same clothing. Which is interesting. But it was around now, we're in 1880, and there's a recession in France, and Durand-Ruel, who was the dealer for most of these artists, was about to go broke. And Mary Cassatt went up to him and she said, show in New York, I'll arrange it, I'll help you to arrange it. So he takes a whole bunch of Impressionist works to New York, and it's the first time the American public has seen Impressionist work. It's a huge success. It bails out Durand-Ruel and therefore saves the Impressionists. So, and also Degas is a sensation over there because she's promoting him along with the other Impressionists. Another pastel. Wendy, she's using that very strong white here again with black. It's almost it suggests the influence of Manet a little bit. Interesting composition though, because you can hardly see the woman's face.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
This was started in the boating party was started in 1890, but she worked on it for several years. It's a huge painting. And what we're seeing here is both the influence of Japanese art in the flattening of perspective, the simplification of the treatment of surfaces, very strong emphasis on the spaces between things and an unusual composition, but also the influence of Gauguin, who she knew, who flattened the picture frame. But this was the centerpiece of her first American show in around 1895. So in 1890, there was a huge exhibition in Paris of Japanese prints, and she acquired a number, but she also she'd been playing around with Degas with dry point prints. They were actually going to create a book together, though he walked out on the project at a certain time without explanation. But this is dry point, which is where you incise a line on a copper plate by hand. But what she did was she then applied color to the plate and printed the colors onto the print as well. Very laborious process, but beautiful results. And interestingly, we know, because of a letter, we know that Pizarro saw these prints and was really impressed. He wrote to his son Lucien. That was the son who ended up painting in England, if you remember. He said to Lucien, "It is absolutely necessary, while what I saw yesterday at Miss Cassatt's is still fresh in my mind, to tell you about the colored engravings she is to show at Durand-Ruel's at the same time as I. You remember the effects you strove for in Eragny, which is where they were living? Well, Miss Cassatt has realized just such effects, and admirably, the tone even, subtle, delicate, without stains or seams, adorable blues, fresh rose, etc. Then what must we have to succeed? Money, yes, just a little money. We have to have copper plates of high quality. This was a bit of a nuisance, but it is absolutely necessary to have uniform and impeccable grains and a good printer. But the result is admirable, as beautiful as Japanese work, and it's done with printer's ink. So this also gives you some sense of the interaction between all these artists. Pizarro had obviously visited her in her studio. One of her very famous works, and I think utterly beautiful and tender painting, with the stripes of the dress play such an important role in this painting. This is interesting. It's called, what is it called? Oh, Summertime. What's interesting is there's a boat here that she hasn't even bothered to detail, and yet the painting works quite well. Again, remember, these are painted in the studio, not on site. Another one of the dry points. She eventually returns to the United States. And like Degas, her eyes begin to fail at a certain point. And she actually ultimately ceases painting. She has about a decade where she doesn't paint, but she was doing a number of other things. In 1915, she donated a whole bunch of her works and Degas' works to an auction for women's suffrage. She was a suffragette her whole life. And she publicly laughed at the irony of Degas' paintings being raising money for women's suffrage. She also advised the Havermeyer family to create a huge impressionist collection, which actually forms the core of the Metropolitan Collection in New York. So she was, her involvement with the Impressionists was really very critical, if you think about it, to the survival of the movement and to it ultimately prospering. And that's it for tonight's presentation. Any comments or questions? Or, and Susie, if you want to say anything, you're welcome to too.
If you want to say anything.
Oh, no, it was